Got younger children and they'd like to lead singing for a song or two, bring them this evening at 5:45, and we'll do that for about 10 to 15 minutes before getting started this evening. The lesson this morning is on the reflections on the godly home. When we think about the worldly home, or we think about the godly home, it's very much related to Christianity. If we believe in a worldview, we believe in a philosophy where Christianity ought to be the dominant ethical system in our society, one of the things directly tied to that ought to be how we rear our children, how we operate as parents, how we operate as spouses. And so we think about the premises that are set forth in the cross, we think about Jesus Christ and what He died for. Everything that is embodied within Him and in what He is ought to shine through in our godly homes as well. It seems to me to be a paradox, to be a contradiction rather, that one might argue that Christianity is the religion that ought to be honored, as one then leads a life that reflects a horrible example as being the home. There are several implications that we ought to consider, and we'll examine these from three different perspectives this morning as to how our homes ought to look and how they ought to operate. The first one, simply put, is the responsibility of the man. If you take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, Paul makes it very clear, he makes it very pointed when he says to us exactly what the role of the man is. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, "I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man." And he says, and the head of Christ is God. There's nothing shocking about this, but it should be the man who takes up the role of the leader in leading a godly home and leading a godly example. You can see it, I can see it. We look into the world today, and it seems like our youth, our teenagers and our college-aged kids, it seems to me that they would make horrible spouses to a large degree. I'm speaking generally, I'm not speaking about everybody. But it seems to me very clearly that there are a lot of individuals, and maybe it's always been that way, but there are a lot of individuals that just would make horrible spouses. And so you hear the young women blaming the young men, well, if there were any men out there that were worth having as a spouse. And then it can go the exact opposite way. Well, if there were only some women worth having as spouses. It seems like it's a universal problem. What's our obligation? We won't read these passages, but in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and then also 1 Corinthians 7, Paul and Peter both say to the young women, if you see a man who's living unruly, convert him. Live like a Christian. Demonstrate true Christianity in the way you operate, and let the man see that and be converted by your manner of life. The King James says conversation. But what about the man? What if the woman's not worth having, and she doesn't necessarily like to be like the godly woman ought to be? Well, then the man ought to take the leadership role and say, this is how Christ has designated for us to act. Either way it goes, it ought to be that both parties are living as Christians ought. But you know, one of the things about women, it says in 1 Peter chapter 3, is that they follow. They go after an example. And so men, we have a responsibility placed upon ourselves to be leaders. And it's shocking to me that we see individuals in the world that do not have a problem when it comes to our work. It's not a problem when it comes to coaching a sporting team or maybe organizing some social club. Men will take charge in a lot of ways. And I understand that some men just aren't natural leaders, and that's perfectly fine as well. But it is shocking to me that individuals who are leaders in secular ways simply sit in the back seat and take the back burner, and they won't step up and take the role like the man ought. That is shocking when it comes to Christianity. The man ought to be one who grabs a hold of his family, who grabs a hold of everything that they stand for. And that man ought to say, this is the way that God has designated we're to live. We plan. We make goals. We have certain opportunities that we really strive to fulfill. And when it comes to our Christian lives, it ought to be no different. The man ought to be one who is a natural-born leader, head of the household. If you take a look at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 23, Paul's going to say it this way, saying about the same kind of thing. We're going to toggle back and forth through some of these chapters, and we'll look at them several times. But in Ephesians chapter 5, in verse 23, he's speaking on this kind of thing, and he says, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. Now this is hardly sexist. This is hardly misogynistic, as Paul is writing that the man should be the leader. He's not saying that the man is greater than the woman, or that the woman is less than the man. But what he is simply saying is that this is the man's responsibility. And the woman has responsibilities as well. We'll talk about those here in a moment. But it is the job of the man to set forth an example, to lead his home in a way that he ought, and to point ultimately the house towards Christ. When we think about planning, and we think about our families, and we think about what all they ought to stand for, there are a couple of areas in which we really need to take note. The first one is that the husband, the man, the father, needs to be a balanced figure. He needs to be one who knows how to execute sound, proper judgment. Take a look at Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to read about an example here where God is recalling the fathers, the people of Israel, way back from the Old Testament times. And in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, he says, you've forgotten this. You've let this slip out of your minds. And he says in 12:5, it speaks unto you even as unto children. And he says, my son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. And he says in verse 6, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. Well, if you can endure, if you can stand chastening, God deals with you as with sons. That's how sons receive discipline, judgment. And he says in verse 7, going on, he says, for what son is he whom the father chasteneth not? What kind of child goes without proper discipline? But in verse 8 he says, but if you be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye all illegitimate children, and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh. Now watch this in verse 9. Speaking of the fathers, he says, we have had fathers of our flesh, which corrected us. But he goes on and he says, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not then much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? And in verse 10 he says, for these are the human fathers, they chastened us after their pleasure. And he says, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. As fathers, sometimes we make the bad decision. We make the wrong call. I remember a time where I got reprimanded and it wasn't even my fault. Believe it or not. I know that sounds strange coming from the child's mouth, but it wasn't my fault in that occurrence, in that instance. And I was reprimanded for it. Well, is the father wrong? He is. But he's trying to fulfill his job. He's trying to take note of the seriousness of the task before him. This child needs to see God. This child needs to go to heaven. And when our fathers make no attempt to do that, shame on us. Shame on us for not even trying to be godly Christian fathers and to point our children towards righteousness. When we think about fathers, though, they need to sometimes take note about how to be balanced. And instead of always bringing out the paddle to spank the child's rear end, maybe it's the case that the father needs to take a second thought and say, not this time. Not this time. Or maybe it's the case that the child becomes a teenager. I remember when this happened. And mom and dad's rules actually started loosening up. That was a shock. And I started thinking, what's this about? And looking back on it, I thought, mom and dad were trying to show that they'd give where they could give. And they'd be balanced and let me go the way that I felt I needed to go, as long as it didn't go against the standard of the text. If it was in accordance with God's will, they started loosening up on some of those things, recognizing Drew's going to make his own choices. And that's how it ought to be sometimes. Fathers, we need to take note of sometimes just because we're the leader, it doesn't mean we've always got to have it our way. And sometimes we struggle with that, or sometimes, fathers, we struggle with not disciplining our children enough. We need to be balanced and try to use proper judgment and know exactly how to operate the same way that God would. The second thing we need to be as fathers, as men, as leaders of the homes, is we need to be knowledgeable. Take a look at 1 Peter chapter 3, where I remember Garland Elkins. You probably know him. I actually have a book called, I think it's called One Grape at a Time or something like that, and it actually records him coming to Johnson City and being part of Cherokee there for a very short time. He was in for the week or something. And Rubel Shelley came to town, and he and also the Central Church of Christ opposed Rubel Shelley's trying to push instrumental music into the churches in this area. That's a side note. Anyway, Garland Elkins was talking about 1 Peter 3 one day. And in 1 Peter 3, read the text, verse 5, it says, for after this manner in the old time the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. And in verse 6 it said, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life. And it says that your prayers be not hindered. It said in verse 6 that Sarah called Abraham Lord, and Garland Elkins asked his wife Corinne, honey, why don't you ever call me Lord? And she said, you give me a child at age 100 and we'll talk about it. But what about it? Dwell with the women, it says, according to knowledge. If I'm going to dwell according to knowledge, I better have knowledge. And so it is also with the children. If I'm going to know how to rear my children, I better know something first. If I'm to tell my children to know God, I better know God personally. I cannot teach something that I do not know. And so it is the case that husbands, if we're going to be leaders of our homes, we ought to be the ones taking the role in this thing. It has always shocked me to see individuals in the Lord's church sometimes telling their children we need to gather back at the assembly, or that you hear this prayer sometimes over the closing prayer. They say, help us meet back at the next appointed time, and it's coming from the individual you know will not be there for the Wednesday night assembly. Isn't that shocking? Fathers, if we're going to tell other people, and we're going to tell our children, we're going to tell the congregation how we ought to operate, we better be operating that way. And so we have to have knowledge about God and who He is in order to tell it to others. And then a third thing is we ought to take heed that we do not provoke. Now this is not talking about jesting, joking in a kind manner. I remember my father constantly poking fun at me, and we still do this. I tell him that the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl every year, and this year it's his. He's got it with the Chiefs. We're from Kansas City. But anyway, it's not talking about that when it says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. There's a way that fathers can do that legitimately. And they can pour salt in the wounds of their children. Or maybe they only know negativity and they only deride their children. I remember my cousin being, at a very young age, his parents stopped giving him birthday presents at a very young age. And my parents spoiled me. And I felt so bad for my cousin because there was a radical difference. Fathers, show your kids you love them. And first and foremost, show them that you love them and care about them enough to send them to heaven. If you're not doing that, you are failing in your task. And I would be doing the same. We need to show our children we love God most, and we want them to love God equally. The second point we need to look at is the responsibility of the woman. Well, what's her role in all of this? Oh, we don't like those texts that say she's to be the glory bearer of the man, to sit as a crown upon his head, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 7. And so there's a real struggle today. The woman today wants to be she doesn't just want to bear the glory, she wants to be the glory, to have the glory. And we think about how that's quite opposite from what the biblical text is expressing. You see over and over again in the text, and we'll look at some of those passages, that the woman's supposed to be in subjection or in submission to the husband. And this is not by any means a low view of women. That is not at all what the text is suggesting. But as it is with Christ, to us human beings, so it is with the man to the woman. As it is that Christ is over the man, so it is that the man is over the woman. That doesn't stress inequality. It doesn't stress lack of importance. It stresses the role. It stresses the responsibility. And so it is in the biblical text we see consistently that there are women that are to be exalted, to be noticed for this. I think of Acts chapter 16, verses 14 and 15, where it's Lydia, a seller of purple, that she is actually honored by the apostolic group for her works, for her task. I think of Proverbs 31 and the virtuous woman. I think of Paul and his writings, even though he's accused today of several as being sexist. What about all of the times where Paul praises women? 1 Corinthians 11 and talks about their role there, their task there. What about the fact in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, where it says that it's women that would be saved in childbearing and bringing up those children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? What about Titus 2, 1 through 5, where it says that women, the aged women, should teach the younger women also? Paul hardly then has a small or a low view of the identity of the woman. But nonetheless, we think about the text and we think about some of the individuals that we may be acquainted with. And what I want to look at is Acts chapter 18. You will not find a better example, it seems to me, in your entire Bible than Acts chapter 18 of a woman who knows exactly what her role is. And this is Priscilla. In Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 1, Paul is he's getting ready. He's in the transition of getting ready to start his third missionary journey. Here he comes to Corinth. And it says in 18:1, he departed from Athens, came to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, Acts 18:2, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla. And it says in verse 3, and because he was of the same craft, Paul that is, being tent makers, he abode with them and wrought. And at this point we don't hear too much about Aquila and Priscilla. The text goes on and talks about Paul being at Corinth. But you reach into Acts chapter 18, a few verses down, and you drop down to about verse 24. There was this certain Jew as they came into the city, Ephesus. And his name was Apollos, a man eloquent in speech, a man mighty in the Scriptures. And it says in verse 25 that this man Apollos was instructed in the way of the Lord. And he was being fervent in spirit, and he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. I don't know if you're quite familiar with all what's going on in the book of Acts at this point, but John's baptism is ineffective. It's out of date. And so this man needs to be retaught. And who better to teach him than Paul? Peter? No. In Acts chapter 18:26, the text says this, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. As a team, the two of them take this man Apollos and say, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's have a Bible study. Well, what about you, men? What about you, women? Men, could your wives could you take them with them and them actually be knowledgeable enough? They be knowledgeable enough to take this person and teach them the way of the Lord. And men, what about us? Would we be able to do that? Maybe, maybe not. Nonetheless, this is something that I believe that every Christian and every Christian couple especially ought to strive for. To have enough knowledge to where we could sit down with somebody who's in error on a doctrinal, religious point and say, let's examine what the Word of the Lord says. There is nothing better, so says the books of 2nd and 3rd John, than to know that children walk in truth. And how do we think that they might know it? From parents who first walk in truth starting out. If it's not us, if it's not the parents, if it's not the wife, it's not the husband, who are they looking at to find a godly example? The woman has said, and I said that we'd look at this numerous times. We'll look at Ephesians 5, will be the only one we'll take a look at. But the woman has said in multiple cases to need to be in subjection. I've got all of these references listed here. 1 Peter 3:1, 1 Peter 3:5, 1 Timothy 2:11, Ephesians 5:22, Colossians 3:18. Take a look at Ephesians 5:21. That's the one we'll zone in on here for a moment, and there's a reason for that. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says in verse 21, speaking about the wives, it says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. 22, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. Why do you think there are so many occurrences in the New Testament text that the Bible grabs a hold of the female and says, be in subjection, be in submission? Maybe that's one of the struggles of the female. Maybe that's not typically the male's problem. Maybe it is. And then we ask the question, but what about 5:21? What about it? Look at this. 5:21 isn't talking about women exclusively. It says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. He's coming off the heels of 18, 19, and 20, where he just said in 18, be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. And he gives us these participles of how that happens. How should I be filled with the Spirit, God? Well, he says by speaking to yourselves in songs, hymns, and spiritual songs. He says in verse 20, by giving thanks. He says in verse 21, by being in submission. That's not just to women. That's to men as well. And why do you think that God here in this context, Paul speaking of course, why do you think he's writing to us saying that even the men are to be in submission or subjection? It doesn't seem to evade us. Paul is telling us that we need to work together as a unit. Now, while it's true that the woman is constantly the one in Scripture that's told, be in subjection, be in submission, know your role in relation to the husband, here we have a passage where the husband is being told, submit yourself to your wife. He's not saying that his role now is the one where he's actually under the wife and she has the last say. But what he is saying is, husbands, we ought to take thought about who the wife is and work hand in hand with her in order to operate as the godly home ought. As long as the husband holds this view where he says what goes and he holds the reins, and he holds it like a dictator, the godly home will not be a godly home. And as long as the woman thinks that she has the say and she can call the shots, and the husband can just go ahead and jump in the lake, that home will not be a godly home. The home that God is wanting is one where both parties know their roles, and they both design themselves to seek God and to reflect such values, taking into consideration what each in the party thinks. Well, what about the children? What about this? How should we rear our children? That goes without debate. What's not to be debated is it ought to be in the way of the Lord. What ought to be debated is exactly how we do that. Maybe it's the case that Mary brought up in Bible class. What about family Bible study? You do that? I don't know. If you don't, it's not a problem. But it's definitely a good prerogative. Maybe you do memory verses. Maybe you don't necessarily sit down and read the text, but you give your children an assignment. Hey, learn these 3 scriptures by the end of the week. And you ought to be able to retain them next week and quote them as well. Or maybe it's the case that you make sure your children are studying the text on their own. Or maybe it's the case that you've bought them a book that's on their level. And you hand them the book and say, hey, this has coloring pages even in it, but it also has biblical texts and it has lessons that you need to learn. Let's go through this together. I don't know. I don't know what exactly the way is in which we tell our children these are godly things, these are godly values, but we need to be getting the text before our children. Age 18 is far too late to start telling our children to study their Bibles. It starts when they're little. And if we're going to have them grow up and know how to be leaders in the church and actually taking hold of what the biblical text says and sharing it with others, we're going to have to show them what it looks like in us first. I simply cannot tell my child, study his or her Bible. I simply cannot tell my child to lead a godly life, to seek God first, and betray that very mission and message as I live my own. It starts with us. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, you have this passage, we won't read it, but in Deuteronomy 6, the thing was so severe in the nation of Israel that God told them, whether it's a figurative piece of text or not, I don't know. I really don't know. I've looked at it several times and can't make heads or tails of it. But in Deuteronomy 6 it says that they were to take these pieces of Scripture and bind them onto their wrists and upon their forehead. Now that might have been a figurative thing. But nonetheless, the point that God's making through Moses is your children better become indoctrinated with biblical truth. Are we doing that? And then what about the children? How should the children react towards God? Well, they ought to be obedient. They ought to respond accordingly. They ought to be able to look at mom and dad and say, we need to do what's right, because what you say ought to reflect what God says is right. It's been said, and maybe it's the case that you've picked up on it too, or maybe it's the case you still hold this view, that what you think of your father is what you think of God. In a lot of ways, that's true. And so we turn back to Ephesians chapter 6 and look at this again. He starts off and he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. He says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with promise. But he says to us as parents, and he's saying this to children as well. In 6:4, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. This is twofold. Parents, we better not be provoking our children. We better be giving them something actually necessary to follow. But at the second level, children, we ought to be obeying our parents. Children, we ought to be taking heed to their instruction. And so as we think about the home, the children learn their values at home. We think about mom and dad. They follow mom and dad. It is simply astonishing to see how many people think that the school system should be left to the education of the children. Ask any teacher in the school system. The children who don't have parents are not the educated children. It takes a parent holding their hands. Ask anybody in the church. And your children who grow up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord are the ones who have parents who took enough care and diligence to sit down with them day after day and work with them on their biblical values. If we want to be biblical parents and we want to be biblical children, we've got to do it the text's way. Let's end on this point. It's true that children they're under obligation to obey parents. But notice that where it says in 6:4, it says, in the Lord, for this is right. Or 6:1 rather. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. You ever heard about horrible parents who have actually commanded of their children to do some things that are actually sinful? I've heard of it. What about where daddy says to fudge a little bit on the employment. I remember my dad he owns a butcher shop, and I worked down there for a summer. And the debate came at the end of the summer when I took a different job, whether or not he should file me as an actual employee or just pay me in cash and not deal with all of that. Not deal with actually a hiring of another employee. After all, the taxes would get us. And I remember Daddy said, we need to look into this. And so we did, and sure enough, they ended up having to file because of how much I'd worked there. Believe it or not, I actually worked a lot. They actually had to file me as an employee. These are the kinds of values we need to be teaching our children. It doesn't matter if the state's going to get a little bit more money. What matters is that we follow God. And it is shocking you see parents actually teaching their children to grow up with horrible values. Let's keep that little bit of money from the state. Let's fudge a little bit. Let's lie. Let's be dishonest. What do you think children are learning when the parents are leading with that kind of example? Children, sometimes, and this is a big point, the biggest thing I'm hearing from our youth today when I try to talk to people about God and about religion, the biggest thing I'm hearing from our youth is that our parents have failed us. The biggest thing I am hearing right now is that our parents have failed us. Ask any child who's non-religious today, and their argumentation, it seems to me, always goes back to our parents have failed us. That being said, parents, you know your responsibility. I know my responsibility as a parent. That being said, let me now talk to the youth and tell you your responsibility. Your responsibility has never been to your parents exclusively. It's been to God. Your responsibility has not been to follow mommy and daddy till the day you die. Your responsibility has been to find out what God's values are and what God's ethics are. And to step forward and say, I don't care if my mom and dad did it wrong. I'm going to find God in all of this, and I'm going to do what He thinks is right. Stop making the argument that the parents are to blame. Stop making the argument that the church is to blame. The only person I have to blame for the way I turn out is me. And if we don't take self-responsibility and realize that it's my job to be a faithful child of God, there will be a day coming when God looks at us and says, why weren't you faithful? And there won't be an excuse. But my tongue will confess and my knee will bow and I will recognize who God is in that day. And God is pleading with us in 2 Corinthians 5, Romans 14, Philippians 2. Before that day comes, find out who God is. Seek, search, pray, ask. And don't blame somebody else for why we're not faithful Christians. Whether you're young, whether you're old, I don't care. God doesn't care. The point is this. We have responsibilities in godly homes to raise up godly homes and to be godly people in godly homes. Our responsibility has never been to another person. It's been to God. And this morning, if you're not a child of God, your responsibility is to Him. Your responsibility is to look to Him as the Heavenly Father and say, what is it that you've directed me to do? How can I give you my life? I want to be a servant of yours. If you're not a child of God, obey His plan of salvation, as laid out in Acts chapter 8, by hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized. But if you are a child of God and you've erred, you've walked away, you've not been the godly participant that you want to be in your home, whatever needs you might have, now is the convenient time, if you have a need, to come while we